Got our recording started. We're ready to go. Here come a few more friends.
Paige, I can't hear you.
My microphone's not muted, so you should be able to. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Okay. You might want to try.
Good afternoon, Miss Paige.
Good afternoon. You might want to try exiting and coming back in. Are we?
I made this flower.
Oh, that's so pretty. Okay. Oh, here comes a few more people. Carolyn. All right. Okay. Can you identify, which is a fancy Nancy word, for tell me who is in this picture behind me? Who is that? Estelle?
The story we talked about, his name is Johnny Appleseed.
Very good. You're exactly right. This is Johnny Appleseed. What do you remember about Johnny Appleseed? What do you remember about him? Let's see. Carolyn?
Climb the apple tree.
He traveled around the country from Massachusetts to New York,
Oh, wait. See,
to Pennsylvania, Ohio, India, and Illinois, and he traveled across the country planting apple seeds. Russell, do you have a question? This was kind of like a biography, but this was a tall tale. Remember, a tall tale, not everything is true. Some of it's true, but some of it's not true. A biography is a story of a person that is absolutely true. We're going to listen to a biography about a man named George Washington Carver. George Washington Carver. This information is going to be true. If it's true information, is it fiction or nonfiction? Raise your hand. True information, real facts. Is that fiction or nonfiction? Russell?
nonfiction.
Nonfiction. Excellent job. Nonfiction. Okay. Here is some vocabulary words you're going to hear in our story today. Look at this Lego lady. What does she look like? Anya?
A scientist.
She does. She looks like a scientist. There is a name for a type of scientist that studies plants. That's called a botanist. A botanist is a scientist that studies plants. You're going to hear that word in our story. Okay. Today we're going to learn about another person who became famous for his love for plants. Listen carefully to find out how George Washington Carver loved plants and how he became famous. Today you're going to hear about another man who, like Johnny Appleseed, became famous because of his love for plants. He too lived many years ago, but not quite as long ago as Johnny Appleseed's. His name is George Washington Carver. He became famous throughout the United States as a botanist, a scientist who studied plants. George first developed his interest in plants as a young boy. So he first decided that he really liked plants when he was a young boy. As a child, George used his free time to explore the forest surrounding his home on a farm in Missouri. Missouri is in the United States. It's kind of in the middle of the United States towards it's just kind of in the middle. He spent many hours roaming the woods, discovering all sorts of wonderful things. George liked to collect things that caught his eye. George was especially curious about the different kinds of plants that he had noticed during his explorations. He wanted to study these plants further, but he knew that if he pulled them out of the ground and took them back to the cabin, they would die. Why would the plants die if he pulled them out of the ground and took them back to his cabin? Adeline? My mind went blank for a second.
Because they need to grow from the sunlight, the water, and the air.
That is so smart, Adeline. Kiss your brain. Plants need 4 things to survive: water, sunlight, air, and food. And if he pulls the roots out of the ground, if he doesn't put them in water or put them somewhere with nutrients, they're going to miss one of their 4 things and they're not going to survive. So he knew he couldn't just pull the plants out of the ground. They would die. So when George found an interesting plant, he would carefully dig it up from its place it was growing, roots and all. See how some of the plants have the roots and all, so that he could plant it in a special garden close to his cabin. Here the word means garden, as like in this picture, a plot of land where plants grow. The word garden can have other meanings too. Garden can also mean what you do when you put living things into the soil. Right now he is gardening. He's putting a plant into the soil. The place where he keeps the plants is also a garden. George moved plant after plant to this special garden where he looked after each and every plant, watering and caring for them all to make sure they continued to grow. As an adult, George later wrote, "I literally lived in the woods. I wanted to know every strange stone, flower, insect, bird, or beast. Day after day, I spent time in the woods alone in order to collect my floral beauties and put them in my little garden I had hidden in the brush not far from the house." Hey, we learned what a brush was from one of our stories. Is a brush like when I brush my hair? Is that what he's talking about? No. What's he talking about when he says he had them hidden in the brush near his house? Does anyone know? That means a group of bushes. A group of bushes linked together. Okay. Fascinated by the plants in his garden, George spent hours tending, observing, and studying them. In time, he came to learn about the special needs of each plant, how much water each plant needed, whether it grew best in full sunlight or with some shade. George also took a special interest in caring for plants that were not growing well. He became so skillful at caring for these sick plants that people throughout the neighborhood began to call him the plant doctor. Who takes care of you when you're sick? A doctor. Well, your mom, but a doctor. And George is taking care of plants when they're not growing, when they're sick. So they called him the plant doctor. George's passion for plants led him to develop another talent, that of an artist. Of course, his favorite subjects to paint were his beloved plants. Though he did not have a proper canvas or paintbrushes, he improvised with what he could find. A canvas is something that you paint on. Like if you've ever been to the store Michael's, it's almost like a really thick white piece of fabric that's stretched over a wood frame, and you can paint on it, but they're kind of expensive. When you improvise, you make do with something or whatever you have. George made his first paints from different plant parts. He would mash bark, roots, and wild berries and use them to paint on old boards or even flat rocks. George continued to paint throughout his entire life. So there, he's painting on not a canvas, but an old wooden board. And his paints came from berries that he would smush or leaves or whatever he could find because he couldn't afford paint. George was truly a remarkable and talented person. He was an excellent student who learned quickly. He went to study at college, eventually becoming an expert in botany, the study of plants. After he finished college, George became a professor at the famous University of Alabama. Okay, so, a professor is like a teacher, but they teach grown-ups. They teach grown-ups in college. There, he spent the rest of his life continuing to study plants and experiment with ways to grow them better. He discovered many ways to help farmers improve how they grew plants and crops on their farm. Crops are plants that are grown in large numbers to be used by people. So you might see a crop of corn. That's a whole bunch of corn that people grow to sell. Or a crop of cotton plants. That's a whole bunch of cotton plants put together to sell. George encouraged farmers to grow crops other than cotton, especially peanuts and sweet potatoes. He also found many ways to use peanuts in all different types of products, like dyes, oils, and makeup. He even came up with a number of recipes for foods that used peanuts. George Washington Carver is especially remembered today for his discoveries. So he's the most famous for finding ways to use peanuts. Where we live in North Carolina, an easy crop to grow are sweet potatoes and peanuts. So he told farmers, plant peanuts and plant sweet potatoes. Did you know you can make soap from peanut oil? What? Did you know you can make makeup from peanuts? Of course you know this recipe. What's that? Peanut butter. Yum, yum. Okay. You can also make dyes from the oil of peanut. There's an oil can. That's an oil can, that metal thing. It kind of looks like a hang-down light. So you can use oil for that too. So there's lots of different ways you can use peanuts. And he became very famous for that. Okay, now I'm going to ask you some questions and you can raise your hand. What is a botanist? Ooh, what is a botanist? Someone I haven't called on. Ryan?
Scientist.
A scientist is a botanist. Very good, Ryan. Very good. Okay, what or who was the botanist in this read aloud? Do you remember the man's name in the read aloud? Anya?
George Washington Carver.
You remembered the whole thing, Anya. Kiss your brain. George Washington Carver was the famous botanist in our story. Why was George Washington Carver called a plant doctor? Russell, why did they call him the plant doctor?
Because he can make the plants better than they're sick.
He can help doctor the plants and make them better when they're sick, just like a doctor would help you. How did George Washington Carver make his paint? He was also a brilliant artist, but he couldn't afford paint. So what did he do? Are we?
He found the old wooden board by berries.
Very good. Instead of a canvas, he'd use a wooden board or even a flat rock, and he would squish berries to make the different colors of the paint. All right. How did George Washington Carver help farmers? He helped farmers grow crops that people wanted to buy. So how did he help them do that? Estelle?
By making stuff out of things.
Yes. By what particular things did he tell them to plant that could make stuff?
Peanuts, sweet potatoes.
Yes, peanuts and sweet potatoes. He told the farmers, if you want to sell your product, or if you want to sell your crops, which are a whole bunch of plants that are planted together, you need to plant peanut crops and sweet potato crops, because factories can make these things and turn them into all kinds of different things. Okay, let's see. George Washington Carver was an extraordinary and special person in many ways. Of all the different things that George did or accomplished during his life, which one do you think was the most special? What thing did you like the most about George Washington Carver? What did you think was the most interesting thing about him? Ryan?
Sweet potato butter.
Oh, peanut butter. Yeah, I am really happy he invented that, because that's one of my favorite things. That's a good point, Ryan. Anya, what did you find the most interesting about George Washington Carver?
That he used berries as paint and other stuff.
Oh, very good. He was so creative to think, oh, if I smush these berries, I might could use that as paint. Adeline, what did you find interesting?
That he made makeup.
He did, that you could use peanuts in products like makeup. Who would have thought? Russell? What did you find interesting?
That he wrote.
That he what?
That he wrote.
That he wrote or painted?
Wrote.
Okay. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Like the words.
Wrote the words. Okay. Arwie, what did you find interesting?
He find that metal thing and he made that soap out of peanuts.
Yeah, some of these products are just crazy. You can make that out of peanuts. Okay, friends, before we leave today, I want to share with you, tomorrow we're not going to have a live math or a live listening and learning. We will have our morning schedule, but not math. In math, you're going to take your quiz. In listening and learning, you're going to do this. Let me show it to you. You have a project. I'm pulling it up, and we can talk about it. Okay, so down here, it says students will create an edible plant collage. Use yummy fruits and vegetables that you have in your house to create an edible plant collage. Here's what one looks like. Let me pull it up for you. It's pulling up. Just gonna take it a minute. Look at that yummy plant collage. They took strawberries and celery and grapes. Are fruits from plants? Does fruit come from plants? Absolutely it does. Anything anything that comes from a plant you can use to make a plant collage. Then have your mom or dad take a picture. I would love to share these on Monday. So here's an example. Sound good? Okay.